Taisa Kenji Ashida counted his own casualty reports twice on the evening of March 9, 1945, on a small volcanic atoll in the western Pacific that appears in most military histories today as little more than a footnote. He counted them the first time in the ordinary course of compiling his final report to regimental headquarters. He counted them the second time, according to the account later given by his surviving adjutant, because the number simply refused to feel true to him, and he wanted, before committing it to paper and sending it up the chain of command, to be entirely certain he had not made an error. The number did not change. 3,000 of his men dead in the space of 6 days on an island his own staff had assessed, before the American landing, as capable of absorbing an assault of that size for a minimum of 3 weeks. I have recounted the figure and confirmed it is correct, he wrote in the report that would eventually reach Imperial General Headquarters. I submit it nonetheless with the observation that I do not fully understand how it came to be true. Ashida was not a man inclined toward exaggeration, nor toward the kind of romantic despair that colored some of the more dramatic accounts to emerge from the Pacific Island campaigns. He was, by the assessment of officers who served under him, a methodical planner, a man who had spent 18 months preparing the defenses of Mavera Atoll with the patient, unglamorous thoroughness of an engineer, rather than the fatalistic fervor that had characterized some garrison commanders elsewhere in the theater. He had studied the American landings at earlier islands with genuine professional interest, extracting from each engagement whatever lessons seemed applicable to his own situation. He had concluded, correctly by every measure available to him, that a static beach defense designed to stop the Americans at the waterline was a strategy that had already failed everywhere it had been attempted. He built instead a defense in depth interlocking bunkers connected by tunnels cut into the island's volcanic rock, mutually supporting positions designed to survive naval bombardment and continue extracting a cost from the attacking force long after the beaches themselves had fallen. His calculation, communicated in a report to his superiors some months before the American landing, was coldly precise. I do not believe this garrison can prevent the eventual American capture of Mavera Atoll. I believe, based on the defensive architecture I have constructed and the terrain available to exploit, that this garrison can extract a cost sufficiently high that the American public's appetite for further such operations will be meaningfully diminished. This is the objective I am planning toward, and I believe it to be achievable within the resources and time available to me. It was a rational calculation, built on precedent, built on careful study, built on 18 months of preparation that Ashida genuinely believed had accounted for every variable a professional soldier could reasonably anticipate. He would spend 6 days in March, discovering that his preparation had accounted for nearly everything, except the specific quality of the men who would eventually be sent against it. The 41st Marine Regiment had been activated in the spring of 1944, built specifically around lessons the Marine Corps had extracted, at considerable cost, from earlier Pacific Island assaults. Its training doctrine, unlike the doctrine that had produced earlier Marine formations, was built around a single explicit premise that its founding commander, Colonel Everett Bragg, articulated in a training memorandum that circulated widely enough to become something close to the regiment's unofficial creed. We are not training men to survive an assault on a fortified position. We are training men to continue functioning as an effective fighting force after that assault has, by any reasonable measure, already gone wrong. This premise shaped every aspect of the regiment's preparation, where earlier training had emphasized coordinated assault under intact command structures. The 41 SD's training deliberately and repeatedly simulated the collapse of those structures' officers, killed mid-exercise, radios destroyed. Entire platoons required to continue an assigned objective with no higher guidance whatsoever, sometimes for the duration of an exercise lasting several days. Major Walter Osai, who commanded the regiment's 2nd Battalion and would lead the assault against what turned out to be the most heavily fortified sector of Ashida's defense, described the philosophy to a war correspondent shortly before the Mavera landing. Most training teaches a man what to do when the plan is working. We spend most of our time teaching men what to do when it isn't. Because on an island like the ones we've been sent to take, the plan stops working somewhere around the second hour every single time, and the men who can't function past that point are the men who don't come home. The regiment's medical and logistics doctrine had been similarly reshaped around the specific horror of island warfare, the reality that wounded men could not always be evacuated quickly, that ammunition resupply could be interrupted for hours or days by the same terrain and defensive architecture that made the assault itself so costly. Corpsmen assigned to the regiment received training considerably beyond standard first aid, intended specifically to keep wounded men alive and functional for extended periods under conditions that regimental medical officers described, with grim understatement, as less than ideal. By the time the 41st Marine Regiment loaded onto transport ships for the assault on Mavera atoll in early March of 1945, its men had spent nearly a year being built specifically for the kind of grinding, fragmented, communication-starved combat that Ashida's defense in depth was designed to produce a coincidence of preparation that neither side could have fully anticipated, and that would shape everything that followed. There was a specific exercise, mentioned repeatedly in post-war veteran interviews, though barely documented in the regiment's official training records, that many of the men who fought at Mavera credited as the single most useful preparation they received. Referred to informally as the scramble, it involved dropping platoons, without warning, into unfamiliar terrain at night, deliberately withholding radio contact for extended periods, and requiring the men to reconstitute effective small unit action entirely through improvised leadership and whatever coordination they could establish among themselves. One veteran, interviewed for a regimental oral history decades later, described the exercise's underlying lesson in terms that echoed almost exactly what would later happen on the island itself. First few times you do the scramble, everybody just kind of freezes up, waiting for somebody to tell them what's supposed to happen next. Takes a few rounds of it before it clicks that nobody's coming to tell you, and once that clicks, something changes in how a man carries himself in the field. Wasn't fun doing that training, but I don't believe I'd have made it through the first day on that island without it. The landing itself, on the morning of March 4th, unfolded largely as Ashida had planned. His beach defenses, deliberately thin, allowed the first waves of Marines to establish a foothold with relatively modest casualties, drawing them inland toward the interlocking bunker system that represented the true weight of the island's defense. What Ashida's planning had not fully anticipated was the specific response of Marine units when the expected coordination between assault waves broke down amid the confusion of the interior terrain. Captain Louis Ferrante, commanding a company that found itself isolated from its supporting units within the first hour of the advance inland, described the situation in a report filed that evening. Contact with battalion was lost by 0930. My company continued the assigned advance without further orders, engaging bunker positions as encountered rather than waiting for coordination that was, by that point, clearly not going to arrive in any useful time frame. This was, as far as I understood our training, simply what we had been prepared to do. Japanese defenders in the sector, according to the account later given by a surviving NCO, found this response disorienting in a manner that went beyond simple tactical surprise. Gacho Akiro Tanabe, who survived the engagement and was captured several days later, told his interrogators, "We expected the American assault to lose cohesion once contact between units was broken, as we had observed happen elsewhere. Instead, we found ourselves fighting isolated groups that behaved as though they had never expected coordination to survive contact in the first place. This made our defense considerably more difficult to manage than our planning had anticipated. The engagement that most directly challenged Ashida's core defensive assumptions came on March 6th, when Marine engineers, supported by infantry, began systematically clearing the tunnel network connecting his bunker positions, a task his own defensive planning had assumed would take the Americans, at minimum, several additional weeks to accomplish given the network's scale and complexity. Gunnery Sergeant Otis Freeman, leading a combat engineer team assigned to the clearance operation, described the work in terms that convey little of its actual horror. Wasn't glamorous work, wasn't the kind of thing anybody writes home about in detail, was slow, close, and about as dangerous as anything I encountered in that whole war. But we had men who trained specifically for exactly this kind of fighting, and they just kept at it, section by section, day into night into day again, and the tunnels kept opening up one after another. Ashida's own log, recovered after the battle, tracks the tunnel clearances with increasing alarm across the following 2 days. Sector 4, tunnel network compromised. Sector 7, tunnel network compromised. The rate of clearance being achieved by the American engineers exceeds any planning assumption available to me. I am revising my estimate of the garrison's remaining defensive endurance downward considerably. Recognizing that his defense in depth was being methodically dismantled faster than planned, Ashida ordered a major night counterattack on March 7th, committing a significant portion of his remaining garrison in an assault intended to disrupt the American advance and buy additional time for the remaining defenders to reorganize. The attack, launched under cover of darkness against Marine positions that had advanced further inland than Japanese intelligence had assessed, achieved initial surprise. What followed, according to both American and Japanese accounts, was a night of close, chaotic combat that neither side's official records fully capture. Sergeant Curtis Vance, whose platoon absorbed the leading edge of the counterattack, later described the engagement to a regimental historian. Wasn't really fighting the way training teaches you to picture it, was mostly just holding ground in the dark, close enough to see faces, close enough that you couldn't always tell whose shout was whose. Went on for hours. Don't know exactly how long. If I'm honest, time gets strange in that kind of fighting. Ashida's own assessment of the attack's failure, recorded in his log the following morning, offers a rare glimpse of a professional officer confronting evidence that directly contradicted his operational assumptions. The counterattack failed to achieve its objective. American positions, despite being engaged at close range under conditions of darkness and confusion that should have favored the attacking force, maintained sufficient cohesion to repel the assault with what I assess as moderate rather than the severe casualties I had anticipated inflicting. I do not yet fully understand the tactical mechanism by which this cohesion was maintained. One of the most difficult engagements of the campaign occurred on March 8th, when Marine forces located and assaulted a fortified cave complex that Japanese forces had converted into an underground hospital, and command post a position defended with particular desperation by wounded and able-bodied defenders alike, according to accounts from both sides. Corporal Nathaniel Doyle, part of the assault element, described the engagement's psychological weight in an interview conducted decades later. Knew going in there'd be wounded men in there, not just fighters. Made the whole thing harder in a way training doesn't really prepare you for. Wasn't a clean fight. Wasn't ever going to be. Just did what needed doing and tried not to think too hard about it until later, which is about all you can do in that kind of fighting. The cave complex fell by nightfall. Ashida's log entry for the day is notably shorter than his previous entries and ends with a line that his adjutant later described as uncharacteristic of his commanding officer's usual precision. I do not have an adequate account of today's losses to include in this entry. I will provide a complete figure tomorrow, once I have had opportunity to verify it properly. The final major action of the campaign came on March 9th, when the remaining organized Japanese defense, concentrated in the island's northern sector, was overrun following 2 days of continuous engagement that had left both sides, by every surviving account, operating at the outer edge of physical and psychological endurance. It was that evening, in the aftermath of the sector's collapse, that Ashida compiled the casualty report that would become the defining document of his command. His adjutant, Chui Masaru Ito, one of the few surviving officers from Ashida's staff, gave an account of that evening decades later that remains the most complete surviving description of the moment. The colonel asked for the casualty figures to be brought to him personally rather than simply included in the routine report. When I brought them, he read the total, set the paper down, and asked me to recount the underlying unit reports myself, independently, while he did the same. We worked in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. When we finished, our totals matched exactly. 3,000 men in 6 days, from a garrison that had numbered at the start of the American landing just over 4,000. He looked at the number for a long time before he spoke. He said, "I built defenses I believed could hold for 3 weeks. I do not fully understand what I encountered instead, but I believe I owe headquarters an honest account of it rather than a comfortable one." He wrote the report himself that night and did not ask me to review it before it was sent. Gunnery Sergeant Otis Freeman, the combat engineer whose team methodically cleared Ashida's tunnel network faster than any Japanese planning had anticipated, was 30 years old, older than most of the men under his command. A former mining engineer from West Virginia whose pre-war experience with underground work proved, in the specific horror of Mavera's tunnels, unexpectedly relevant. Asked years later what had allowed his team to maintain the pace of clearance they achieved despite the extraordinary danger involved, Freeman gave an answer notable for its plain, almost technical framing. Wasn't bravery, mostly, whatever people want to call it after the fact. Was just doing the job methodically, the way you'd clear any dangerous underground working section by section. Careful, don't skip steps, because you're tired or scared, because skipping steps is how men die down there, tunnel or mine shaft, doesn't much matter which. Training gave us the method. Method's what got us through it, more than any particular courage on my part. Sergeant Curtis Vance, whose platoon held its position through the chaotic night counterattack of March 7th, offered a similarly understated account when interviewed for a regimental history project. Don't remember making any particular decision to hold, if I'm honest. Just remember everybody around me doing their part, and me doing mine, and somehow that added up to a line that didn't break, even though I couldn't have told you, in the middle of it, exactly why it wasn't breaking. Figured that out more afterward than during, thinking back on it. Private First Class Harley's Ward, a young rifleman who fought through the hospital cave engagement on March 8th, gave what may be the campaign's most direct account of the psychological cost involved, in an interview conducted for a veteran's oral history archive nearly 40 years later. Some of what happened in there, I still don't talk about much, even now. What I'll say is that everybody who went into that cave came out of it different than they went in, and I don't think that's a thing training can fully prepare a man for, no matter how good the training is. We did the job. I'm not sorry we did it. I'm just honest that it cost something none of us got back. Ashida's own report, quoted extensively above, remains the primary document of the campaign's aftermath from the Japanese side. But a broader assessment, compiled some months later by Chujo Heideki Sakamoto, the theater commander to whom Ashida's report was ultimately forwarded, offers a wider professional perspective on what the Mavera garrison's collapse represented within the broader arc of the Pacific Campaign. I have reviewed Colonel Ashida's report and the supporting documentation with considerable care. Sakamoto wrote in a post-war account compiled for a study of the island campaign's final phase. Ashida was, by every measure available to me, among the more capable garrison commanders this army fielded in the Pacific Theater. His defensive preparations at Mavera were on paper exemplary, a defense in depth, constructed with genuine engineering sophistication, informed by careful study of earlier American assaults. That this defense was overcome in 6 days rather than the 3 weeks Ashida's planning anticipated is not, in my assessment, a reflection of any deficiency in his preparation. It is a reflection of an adversary that had, by early 1945, developed a capacity for sustained, fragmented, communication-degraded combat that our own planning assumptions had not adequately accounted for. He continues, in a passage later cited by historians studying the closing phase of the island campaigns. We had built our defensive doctrine around the assumption that American assault cohesion would degrade predictably once contact between units was disrupted, based on patterns observed in earlier engagements. What we encountered at Mavera, and increasingly elsewhere in this final period of the war, was an American force that appeared to have specifically trained for the collapse of that cohesion, treating disrupted communication and isolated combat not as a crisis to be endured, but as an expected condition to continue functioning within. I do not believe our doctrine adequately anticipated an enemy that trained for its own confusion as deliberately as it trained for its own success. Kenji Ashida did not survive the battle. He was killed on the morning of March 10th, in circumstances his surviving adjutant described only briefly in later testimony, during a final action in the island's last defended position. His report, however, survived carried by courier to regimental headquarters before the final collapse, and from there through the theater command structure, eventually finding its way, in the post-war period, into the historical record examined by researchers studying the Pacific Campaign's closing months. Chuy Ito, the adjutant who had recounted the casualty figures alongside his commander on the night of March 9th, survived the war and was interviewed extensively decades later for a historical project examining the Mavera campaign from the Japanese perspective. Asked what he believed his commander had ultimately understood in those final hours about the men who had overcome his defenses so much faster than any calculation had predicted, Ito offered an answer he acknowledged was, in the end, his own interpretation rather than anything Ashida had stated directly. I believe the colonel understood, by that final night, that he had built his defense against an enemy that no longer existed in the form his planning assumed. He had studied earlier landings carefully, and his study was not wrong. Exactly, it was simply incomplete, because the Americans themselves had changed between those earlier landings and the one he faced. He built a defense for one enemy and received, instead, an enemy that had spent a year learning to survive exactly the kind of defense he had built. I do not know if this understanding brought him any comfort in his final hours. I know only that he wanted the true number recorded honestly, rather than softened for the comfort of the men who would read his report, and I have always believed that decision said something essential about the kind of officer and the kind of man he was. On the American side, the 41st Marine Regiment's own after-action report, considerably less introspective than Ashida's final document, closes with a single line from Colonel Bragg that regimental veterans would repeat, in various forms, at reunions for decades afterward. We trained for a year to keep fighting after the plan fell apart. On Mavera, the plan fell apart in the first hour, same as it always does, and the men kept fighting anyway. That was the whole of what we built them to do, and they did it. Freeman, the engineer whose team cleared Ashida's tunnel network faster than any Japanese planning had thought possible, was asked once, late in his life, whether he had ever thought about the men on the other side of those tunnels, the defenders whose own preparation, however thorough, had simply been overtaken by an enemy built differently than anyone had anticipated. He considered the question for a long moment, in the same unhurried way he seemed to consider most things, before answering. Thought about it plenty over the years. Don't know that colonel's name, the one who counted his numbers twice. Heard the story secondhand, same as most people did. But I'll say this man who does that recounts a number because it's too hard to believe, and then sends the true one up the line anyway instead of softening it. That's a man who was doing his job with some measure of honesty right to the end. Don't take anything away from what we did out there to say that. Just seems worth saying all the same. 3,000 men, counted once, then counted again, because the number felt too large to be true even to the officer who had spent 18 months preparing for every version of the battle he could imagine, except in the end, the one he actually got. That is the whole of the story. That is all it ever was.